One, we're going to be looking at the scope and nature of the construction industry. Some of the specific things we're going to be looking at are employment, the economy, and the environment, and how the construction industry impacts on the Australian employment levels, the Australian economy, and the Australian environment. We'll also be introducing you to these three different organisations, the CFMEU, the HIA, and the NBA, and by the end of the lesson, you'll hopefully be able to define what they are. So we get started with what we're going to know, understand, and do by the end of this lesson. So the first thing, we are going to know the three key players in the construction industry in Australia. We're going to understand the relationship of the construction industry to Australia's economy and employment levels, okay, as well as the environment. And we are going to do, at the end of the lesson, you're going to create a glossary of terms for this unit. There's all of those really key terms, those tier 3 words that we need you to know and understand and use effectively in your extended response writing. So you need to become really familiar with these terms. So when you do that glossary of terms, it's really important that you put those definitions in words that you understand. It's not just going to be good enough to go and copy them straight out of Google or Wikipedia. So we'll get started and we'll talk about the construction industry in Australia. Now, the construction industry is focused on construction, demolition, renovation, maintenance or repair of buildings and infrastructure. It covers a wide range of services all the way from planning and surveying right through to structural construction and finishing services, including like the paintings and decorating. The construction industry generates over $360 billion in revenue. $360 billion in revenue for Australia. And that's approximately 9% of Australia's gross domestic product, or GDP, as you can see there. And when we're looking at the construction industry and this money that it's making and the contribution it's making to Australia's economy, we're really expecting that there is an annual growth of 2.4% in the next 5 years. So the construction industry is continuing to grow. There are some industries in the country that are not in growth mode at the moment. They might either be flat or they might be starting to decline. Construction is not one of those. So it's a good industry for you to be working in. Now we look at what these businesses in the industry actually look like. Well, most of them are either a sole trader or a very small company that might employ 20 or so people. Most of them tend to be Australian owned, and the sales that they make or the money that they make happens domestically. So it happens in Australia. So Australian companies working in Australia on Australian projects. Despite that, we are actually still importing many of our materials from overseas, and progressively we're actually going to see more and more materials come from overseas. Now Australia is a great producer of different things. We're really good at producing steels and irons and coals and things like that, but there are plenty of products that we need to get imported from other countries. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about those materials that are coming from overseas. The industry is what we call heavily regulated. Okay? Basically, there is a whole heap of government organizations and external associations that are responsible for regulating or making sure that our construction work is in line with standards and expectations in the industry. Because obviously, we play a really big role in people's lives. We build their workplaces, we build their hospitals, we build their houses, we build their parks, we build their cities, their roads. So it's important that everything is done to a maximum level of safety, to a maximum level of compliance with environmental requirements. So there's a whole heap of regulations and rules around what we can and can't do in the construction industry. Now, there's a whole heap of jobs that exist in the construction industry that need even further regulation, or what we call licensing. And the vocational education system in Australia, so this is things like TAFEs, private colleges, and even you right now at school obtaining your Certificate 2 in construction pathways, we play a really important role in getting people ready for those careers. And through those processes, once you've achieved the appropriate level of qualification, you can be licensed in your occupation. So you can't just go out and run a building company. You need to be licensed as a builder. You can't just go and be an electrician and run an electrician company. You need to be licensed as an electrician or licensed as a plumber. Okay, so this licensing exists in many of our occupations in our industry because of the heavy level of regulation and the really strict rules around how things need to get done. Now, our industry, the construction industry, differs from many other industries that operate around the place. We have training boards, we have certain training levels that exist as well, And we also make sure that the money that is collected through different levy schemes or taxes and different processes like that actually goes back to training more people in the industry. So there's a whole heap of information around levy schemes and things like that, but think of your training and apprenticeships, okay? A lot of what you will do if you choose to go on and do a Certificate 3 in construction, in carpentry, joinery, or any of your specialized fields, if you're doing that Certificate 3, a lot of your course is actually subsidized because there is such a high demand for people in our industry that are highly qualified, skilled laborers, okay? Now, we've spoken about the construction industry being its own thing, but we work really closely with all of these other industries. And there are heaps of industries we work with, okay? And I'm going to point out a couple of them that you should be familiar with. So obviously we work really closely with the building services industry, the cement industry, the electrical industry, the plumbing industry. Might be some really simple ones you think of, but we also work with the telecommunication industry, okay? Making sure that infrastructure is in our buildings progressively when they're needed as we start to assemble them and finish them off. We also need to think of things like waste management. Okay? Where does our rubbish from our construction and demolition go? What about the water, sewage and drainage services that need to exist in our projects? What about those raw materials, so quarry industries, the timber and paper products industry, where we get our lumber from, the firefighting industry, and making sure that we have the appropriate fire sprinkler systems and fire alert alarm systems in our commercial buildings, all the way through to the gardening services, finishing off our projects with landscaped areas. So if we look at the construction industry then, we look at some of the key occupations. Now I haven't put them all in there, but here are some of the key occupations. You can see in blue on the chart are the current numbers of people, percentages of people working in these areas. So we've got around about 10% of people in the construction industry are carpenters and joiners. We've got about 8% of them are construction managers. We've got about 8% of them are electricians, about 7% of them are plumbers. And you can see the data there. What's interesting though is when we start looking at the employment projection, so where we see the growth of this industry going in roles, there is a shortage in almost all of these areas. Okay? We don't have enough carpenters and joiners to meet the demands of the future. We don't have enough construction managers. We're close, but we don't have enough construction managers. If you look down the bottom, some of the other skilled occupations that are missing, painters. There is a huge gap there. Building and plumbing laborers, there is a massive gap there. And an absolutely enormous gap in the number of architect, building, and surveying technicians that exist now to what is going to be needed in the future. So this sort of chart is really interesting to you if you're thinking, well, what do I want to specialize in? I know I want to be a construction worker, but I don't know exactly what I want to do. Now, we talk about trade callings and we talk about specializations. If you want to go on to be a tradesperson and you want to be qualified to do that job without the supervision, being an apprentice or without being a laborer, then you need to go on and do additional study in a Certificate 3 level in one of these trades and specializations. So if you're looking at an area of growth where there is going to be some job security, start looking at these areas where the orange line is far bigger than the blue line, okay? Because the employment projections are that these jobs need more people. I'm also having a look here at our employment levels and projection, okay? So we can start to see when we're looking here, the number of people, this is in hundreds of thousands, by the way. Back in the year 2000, there were about 700,000 people working in construction. About 700,000. 10 years later, we are at 1 million people currently working in the construction industry. Another 10 years later, and you can see that the employment projection is continuing to grow. This is a massive area of growth for Australia. There are more and more people needing to fill jobs in the construction industry. And we know this is the case because everywhere we look now, there are construction projects. Now, I'm working from home, and you're probably learning this from home right now, and I'm looking out the window onto the street, and I can see 2 development proposals for 2 different properties directly across the road from me. If I went for a walk around the block, I reckon I would find about 5 different houses that are just about to begin development or in the process of development. And then we think commercial development. That whole Liverpool city is filled with cranes at the moment because of the number of buildings and number of construction projects that are currently happening. More projects means more jobs, and you can see that there is a continued progression and projection that there are going to be more workers needed in the construction industry into the future. So I did a bit of research and said, okay, well, what skills are needed, what occupations will be needed, and what are the key employers? So if I'm looking for a job, who should I be looking at? So I've got some top 5s here for you. Top 5 in terms of the generic skills. The number 1 skill that people working in the construction industry are looking for is your ability to communicate. Your ability to communicate will be paramount to how successful you are in your career. If you can't communicate correctly in the job interview process, that's going to be detrimental to you. But communication is just so key. And I've actually got a whole lecture coming up later in this unit where we are going to look at how to communicate effectively when you're at work. They're looking for planning skills, okay? Your ability to plan out projects or plan out tasks, sequence them in the right order, and understand how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together to finish a project. They're also looking for detailed-oriented people. People that are able to focus on every little detail and not just say, oh yeah, but it's good enough. We've got enough of those workers. We're looking for the highly skilled, detail-oriented workers. We're also looking for relational workers, people that can build relationships and manage the relationships between bosses and employees, employees and employees, suppliers and the construction workers, between the key players like the architects, the engineers, the client and the construction team. Okay? The ability to manage those relationships, keep those relationships positive, and basically leverage them to benefit the project that the client has requested. And lastly, there is actually a generic skill expectation that you are proficient in Microsoft Office. Now, when I talk about Microsoft Office, I'm talking about you are proficient in Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel and Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Outlook. I'm going to run through very quickly the 4 of those. Microsoft Word you're going to be using to produce invoices to send to customers, to produce potentially flyers, quotes, all of those sorts of written documentation that you would send out to your clients. Microsoft Excel you're going to use to track budgeting expectations, project timelines, etc. Microsoft PowerPoint you'll probably use to present your tender for a project or to present your ideas on different solutions to problems you might come across, as well as running different construction project management meetings. And Microsoft Outlook because it comes back to communication, your ability to communicate effectively with all of the key players and be organized. We skip over now to the top 5 occupations. They're the top 5 occupations in the skills and occupation forecast coming from the Job Outlook website. They're saying architectural building and surveying, project management, civil engineers, electricians, carpenters and joiners. Okay, now, our current pathway that we've been guiding you towards has been towards the carpentry and joiner pathways. But that being said, if you wanted to continue on, do your trade, some of the units that we have done in this course can count towards those Certificate 3 levels. And lastly, the top 5 employers in Australia right now: Lendlease, KBR Incorporated, John Holland, CPB Contractors, and Laser Electrical. These are really big level employers. I'm not talking about little ma and pa businesses. Your dad or your uncle or your auntie might run a little construction company somewhere around the way. I'm not talking about those little companies. I'm talking about those really big employing companies that might have thousands of employees. These are the top 5 at the moment. All right, so now we get down to those regulatory requirements. There are some things that when you are building, you must comply with. They are the rules that you are expected to comply with. If you don't comply with them, your building will not be certified. your building may be unsafe, and your building won't meet the quality requirements that are expected of our industry. There's three main things that we're going to talk about here. Now, obviously, we've spoken in a previous unit about health and safety requirements. That is obviously underpinning everything that we're doing in our work, but I'm not talking about that here today. It's still included, okay, but I'm going to focus on the three additionals: building regulations, council requirements, and Australian standards. There is the National Construction Code. Previously was the Building Code of Australia, but we now have this National Construction Code. Every state and territory has joined in and agreed that we have this one document that sets out the regulations for building works, for plumbing works in commercial and domestic settings. If you don't comply with those building regulations, your building is not compliant. That's going to have all sorts of implications, but to summarize and fast track some of the implications, if your building is not compliant, your building can't be insured. If your building can't be insured, then the client is not going to be happy that they have paid you potentially millions of dollars for this project and they can't even insure it. Therefore, they may not pay you, and that's going to have impacts on your back pocket as an individual worker. There are council requirements as well. Every council has their own requirements. This might be around how close houses can be, how tall houses can be, what color houses can be, what sort of finishes and products you can use, whether you must have a water tank, whether you must have solar panels. Every council has their own set of requirements that you comply with. And then we've also got the Australian standards. The Australian standards are linked almost perfectly intertwined with the New Zealand standards, so Australian and New Zealand standards, but they're also linked with the international standards. So you've probably heard me talk previously about AS 1100, the Australian standard 1100, which is the technical drawing standard in Australia. Well, we also have ISOs, okay? International standards that have been developed with all countries that have joined into the ISO organization, the International Standards Organization, to make sure that we all agree on the basic standard expectations and how things get done. Now, standards are guidelines to make sure we meet requirements. Helps to make things consistent. So we're now talking about three key bodies. So when you've got your notes here and you might be writing your notes down, there are three key players that we need to know about in the construction industry. The first is the CFMEU, the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union. This is your union. This union represents over 100,000 construction workers in Australia. There are individual branches for each state. Okay. Sorry, this is the state one. There are individual branches for each state, and when you combine them together, there'd be over 1 million workers, sorry. Their role is to protect you. They really focus on two main areas. One of them is keeping you safe at work, and the other is making sure your working conditions are decent. So when we talk about keeping you safe at work, if an individual says to their boss, "Oh, I don't feel comfortable doing that, it seems really dangerous to me," sometimes the boss might laugh them off and not take them seriously. The benefit of being a union member is that you can get that union to represent you. And because the union has so many members, hundreds of thousands, for example, they have a lot of pull, they have a lot of weight, and they also have a lot of money because you pay to join a union. And so their money can go towards taking your employer to court if required for any breaches of safety legislation where they've endangered workers' lives. But they can also use their power and their position to encourage and sort of change the industry to be safer for the better. Now, their goal here isn't to sue workers. Their goal is, to sue companies. Their goal is to keep the workers safe, and they will do whatever they can to make sure that they are protecting their workers. The second thing is for fighting for decent work, decent wages and working conditions. So you've probably seen lots of strikes happening. Strikes are organized usually by unions. Unions are groups of members that pay to be in the union. They join together, and the power of the people means that they are able to negotiate what they want. So when the industry awards are changing or when your enterprise agreement is due for update, your union plays a major role in making sure that you get an increase in your wages and working conditions. Some of the things that you might have you might have had happen in the construction industry that are a benefit to the union, thanks to the union. In Queensland last year, they changed a law that said if it's too hot and too humid, okay, they set some specific guidelines. I think it was approximately 35 degrees and then 80% humidity. If you get above those conditions, no worker in construction should be working because it is unsafe for them. They fought that battle for many, many years, and last year they won that battle, and that means all of their workers are now protected with a working condition that also keeps them safe. You might have also heard of different increases in enterprise bargaining and the amount of money that people get paid. These are wins that come through the union. There are government mandated increases where sometimes the minimum wage increases and you have to pay your employees more. But the union really plays an absolutely pivotal role in making sure that our wages are always being fought for when they are deserved, that we get more. Now, unions take on that negotiating position for us. Second organisation is the Housing Industry Association. The Housing Industry Association, or the HIA, is the official body of Australia's home building industry. So the construction industry can be split up into sub-industries. One of them is the housing or the home building industry. And this organisation helps people in the industry, helps the workers and the bosses and the employers and the employees, making sure that they have a united voice, that they promote the industry standards, and they help to connect you with different industry partners. Again, you pay to be a member of the Housing Industry Association, and they are there to support you if you work specifically in housing. And next we've got the Master Builders Association. Again, there is a Master Builders Association in each state. We're looking at the Master Builders Association of New South Wales. They are the leading building and construction industry association across the state. They're a not-for-profit organisation, so they're not there to make money. All of the money that they do make in their memberships basically goes back to the builders that are their members. Okay? Their goal is to represent and further the interests of the building and construction industry. They represent in areas such as industrial relations, so they work closely with the unions. They work closely with health and safety. Okay? So they'll be working really closely with Safe Work New South Wales, for example. They work closely with legal and contracts, training, and government regulations and legislations. So they would be on different boards and government committees providing advice on how things need to change to improve the construction and building industry in Australia. They also develop alliances with key organisations so that the members of this association get those benefits. So they might have deals with key partners like Boral, for example. Now, the Master Builders Association has around about 8,000 members in New South Wales, and they are the only industry body that represents all sectors of the building and construction industry. So if we go back to the HIA, they look specifically at housing. The Master Builders Association covers builders in all areas of the construction industry in Australia. So thanks very much. I know that's been quite a long lecture. I hope that's been really helpful for you, really informative. I've shared the slides with you. There is some work that I've set for you on Google Classroom as well. Please make sure you get to that work and meet the deadlines. Thanks very much.